This story is about you, your enlightenment, and the most important life mastery you'll need on your path of ascending consciousness. Now that you're well on your way in your enlightened transformation, you're going to recognize this fun little character as you ascend. And the story will shed light on just some of the errors and blind spots that are currently interfering with your progress in life. The story starts in a little pond in a clearing in the woods near where you live. The surface is a shimmering reflection of the world above it, an image only interrupted by occasional lily pads and blossoming lilies, and the water ripples that extend from dragonflies dipping to the surface and then back up again. But the surface of the water is irrelevant. It's what's going on below that's so magical. Deep underneath, in the pond, swim millions of little larvae, or we'll call them nymphs. Some swim close to the bottom, where the water is thick and muddy and gloopy with sulphury stuff from yuckiness that's been hiding under the bottom of the pond and from time to time belches up out into the water, which is otherwise very pure and clear. Some of the nymphs swim in the middle and sometimes pop down below and then up a little bit to cleanse. And others swim closer to the surface, where it's quite sparkly and light, and where the grasses and stalks that grow in the pond rise up out of it and into a new dimension altogether. One little nymph, we'll call her Mary, felt like she was becoming something. She felt like she should start swimming a little higher and a little higher in the pond, a little closer to the surface. And she noticed that the more she swam in the clearer water, the better she felt. She felt more like what she knew she was. There were others before her that had done the same, and there were others around her as well, but experiencing it herself was something really special, and not something she'd ever understood from what others had explained about the process. And she told the other nymphs in her old swimming grounds in the denser layers of water about what she'd discovered, and sometimes they were inspired by her and also started spending more time closer to the surface, even though that was a bit different from how they'd always known the pond. And together they started noticing that even though the pond was the same, it seemed quite different from this new place. Now there were more of them. Many more. Some nymphs, especially those who swam near the bottom, were reluctant to listen to what the strange surface nymphs were talking about. They were suspicious, and pointed out that there was nothing wrong with swimming in the sludgier layers of the pond, that this is how it had always been, and it was a natural part of being in an ecosystem that involved the debris of dirt and slimy scum from pond life settling into the bottom and from time to time belching up and out, and that when the sludge belches up you get covered, and that's just the way it is. And that was completely true. The pond was just as worthy and divine from that lower angle as any other, and it was perfect for the creatures that lived there, but not for those creatures who are in the process of becoming something else. There was another group of nymphs near the bottom, and even though they were well adapted to the thick and gloopy vibe down there, they also had a strong inner feeling that they were becoming something, although they didn't know what it was. They did know it wasn't this. and they started to realize that this wasn't the whole truth about life and being a nymph, and they became afraid. And they started watching the nymphs that swam a little higher. Mary and her friends among the lighter layers of water saw the pleas of those ones and swam down to help them rise. They submerged themselves into a thicker and denser water than their little bodies could tolerate. They wanted to soothe and encourage the ones who didn't think they could swim any higher. But what Mary didn't know was that she and her friends weren't quite ready for that, because they were still becoming too. So they started feeling bogged down and dirty and exhausted from trying to drag all the little bottom nymphs up. And she felt hopeless sometimes. How can I swim close to the surface like I know I want to when there are so many down here who can't? She prayed. We just can't carry them all. From time to time, she'd managed to carry a few to higher, lighter layers of the pond, but it seemed that unless the bottom nymphs learned for themselves how to swim in a different density, they'd just end up sinking back down anyway. And some of the bottom nymphs got desperate and clung to Mary and the other surface nymphs who kept going down into the denser layers to help. It didn't always end well. Some of them never came back up. Mary knew she had to let go. Her heart broke as she left the bottom, but the transformation inside of her called her up, and the resistance she was putting up against that transformation so she could stay down longer was getting painful. It was no longer an option. She loved her bottom layer nymph friends, but she had to return to the waters that were clearer, lighter, and full of the sparkle of another dimension, even if they wouldn't come. She was becoming something, and she could no longer deny it. She had to honor it. She looked up and saw how the higher surface nymphs moved in yet lighter waters, and she learned from them. And so she called down to the lower layers of the pond and said, "Look up. Look up and become like this. Just keep looking up." She noticed she wasn't leaving anything behind really, because even as she changed, she was the sum of everything she'd ever been, and an alchemy was happening inside which was greater even than that sum. Now the relief with every inch she rose was like a wave of peace. But even in the lighter waters, she didn't know what was happening, or what this movement was inside her. But once she'd let go of the resistance she had to it, it was such a natural and easy unfolding that it was as if it was doing itself, even without her knowing the way forward. It was just happening. And yet, she still couldn't quite tell which way to go or how to focus her attention. And really she was as confused in her layer of water as the bottom nymphs were in theirs, although she was no longer as afraid as she had been when she swam down below. And then she remembered to look up. Now she was looking at the strange surface, the wobbly veil that shimmered with an indescribable light from some strange source. And although she'd seen it many times before, this time she watched. She didn't try to make sense of the light and texture and movement on that strange veil, but instead just floated where she was and watched. and in her stillness she saw a shape she recognized. Dragonfly. I am Dragonfly. She looked around at the other surface nymphs. Some hadn't seen it. Some knew there was something going on in that veily surface thing, but they weren't quite ready to stop analysing it and comparing themselves to it and trying to think about what it meant and why they were still so different from its image. They weren't quite ready to let the shape come into perfect focus, even outside of the limitations of what they knew. And Mary saw some other nymphs that had recognized the shape. Like her, they knew. She met their eyes, and they knew together. And little by little, the unfolding that was happening anyway revealed what they needed to know in the next moment and the next moment, and in their own time, sometimes together and sometimes in solitude, the little nymphs found their way to the stem of a plant. A flexible and yet strong natural structure that led up and out. When Mary arrived at its solidity, she knew that it was a thing to follow to become what was coming. With gentle and brave steps, she moved through the veil. She shed her skin, the excuvia, and she was a dragonfly. Now Mary knew that she could never go back down to the bottom layers again. But because she had seen that the transformation happens anyway when you allow it, she knew that all she had to do to help the ones who were coming behind her was to be Dragonfly. And they too recognize their greater self in the veil of their consciousness and find a way up. So, this is the most important life mastery for you to embody on your path of enlightenment. Remembering. Remember that you are becoming. Remember that it's safe to allow it. Remember that you must let go. Remember that it's happening for you anyway because it is written in your DNA. Remember to honor your own truth and becoming first, so others can see your demonstration and learn from your way. And remember that you do know the truth, and simply find a strong natural structure to guide your steps, and let your own inner movement do the rest. Remembering is the first of 8 life masteries in the sovereign way of enlightenment, the blade of grass that will lead you through the surface and into the light, where you will be Dragonfly.